So, we're gonna be doing something a little different today. I'm taking on 3 movies at once, and 1 BBC miniseries. Fortunately, they're all based on the same book, so I haven't got quite as much work in front of me. That particular book is practically the original Gothic romance, Jane Eyre. For those of you unfamiliar with the book, or any of the numerous film and television adaptations, the story revolves around a young woman who, after getting abandoned by her nasty aunt and sent to a harsh boarding school, ends up becoming a governess in the house of the moody Mr. Rochester. Jane and Rochester fall in love, but as Shakespeare once pointed out, the course of true love never did run smooth. Now, I'm going to be tackling this a bit differently than my normal way of doing a review. I'm going to be giving you which version I think does the best job with each of the major roles in the story, and then the best version overall. So let's get started with the best version of the title character, the best Jane.
I hope so. I know the difference between informality and insolence. The one I rather like, the other nothing freeborn would submit to even for a salary.
Jane is a hard character to get right, apparently. As quiet as she is, there's a strong will in her and a lot of sass. Most adaptations leave out the sassier side of Jane's character in favor of making her a bit more passive. I think that does Jane a disservice. What attracts Rochester to Jane in the first place is her humor and frankness. Making her passive takes away a good portion of her agency in the story. Having said all that, I'd have to say that Zela Clark, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, is the best Jane. She gives Jane a nice balance between her quieter side and her more playful side. Clark's Jane has quite a bit of passion underneath a cool exterior that fits well with the way that the character was originally written. She also has solid chemistry with her Rochester, Timothy Dalton. Speaking of the moody Mr. Rochester...
Do you find me handsome?
No, sir.
By my word, there is something singular about you.
Very well, madam. I am not a kindly man. Though I did once have a sort of tenderness of heart. You doubt that?
Since then, fortune's knocked me about, kneaded me with her knuckles, till now I flatter myself I'm as hard and tough as an india rubber ball.
Yeah, this one ended up being a tie. They're both really good performances, although for my money, Wells hits the mark a little closer in the looks department. Of course, that's just my opinion. And props to whoever it was that decided to actually attempt to make Timothy Dalton ugly at the end of the miniseries. You don't often see that in adaptations of this story. They tend to scruff him up a little bit, and that's it. So, well done there. But getting back to the performances, I like Dalton a bit more than Wells, although, again, that may be a function of the chemistry he has with Zela Clark. Wells has presence, though, and when he's on screen, you know it. He's big and loud, which works well for the character. Unfortunately, he has a tendency to overpower the other actors. Dalton also has a lot of presence, even if he is a little too handsome. But Dalton's Rochester is in love and is not afraid to show it, which makes him a bit more sympathetic. So that's the leads out of the way. How about we move on to the conscience of the story, Mrs. Fairfax.
I am glad. I'm so glad you are come. Well, one can feel so isolated here, especially in the winter. And it will be most pleasant for me to have someone to converse with on terms of equality.
Mrs. Fairfax isn't as complicated a role as Jane or Rochester, but she's important nonetheless. I called Mrs. Fairfax the conscience of the story, and to a certain extent that's true. Mrs. Fairfax tends to take on an almost motherly role for Jane, dispensing advice and acting as a guide for Jane through the mysteries of Thornfield Hall. It's not a meaty role by any means, but there have been some great actresses who've done some interesting things with it. As far as I'm concerned, Joan Plowright does the best job. She's got a nice motherly air going on without being totally ignorant of the crazy lady in the attic. something that seems to be endemic in other versions, although there doesn't seem to be a bad Mrs. Fairfax to be found, just ones that are more or less blind to the goings-on around them.
Passionate. My Uncle Reed is in heaven. So are my mother and father. They know how you hate me and wish me dead. They see everything you do, and they will judge you, Mrs. Reed.
Child actors tend to be a bit sickly sweet when they're not being actively annoying. And a lot of the story of Jane Eyre involves children in one way or another. The story starts during Jane's childhood, and Jane's student Adele is certainly plot convenient, so child actors are going to have to be called in. Now, you can have some child actors who are generally well thought of as actors, like the 1943 version, which featured a painfully young Elizabeth Taylor and Margaret O'Brien as Helen Burns and Adele respectively. But child actors from that time tended on the overly sweet side, so I can't really recommend them. Now, the best of the child actors, in my opinion, are the ones from the 2011 version. They showed a fair amount of promise without being too cutesy, especially Emilia Clarke, who plays the young Jane. She's got just the right amount of spunk that really makes Jane as a character. Sadly, Mia Wasikowska didn't really hold up her end. I have higher hopes for her in the upcoming Crimson Peak.
I suppose we shall now have an abstract of the memoirs of all the governesses of all our families. May I play you something instead?
Please do.
The world of Jane Eyre is populated by a number of memorable characters, from the acidic Mrs. Reed and her awful offspring, to the cold but not unkind Sigen Rivers. Now, you don't necessarily need big names in these roles, but you do need solid actors who can do the job and do it well. And with that, the 1983 version makes a return to the list. This cast breathes some life into their characters instead of just making them window dressing for the main romance. Now, there aren't any big names in the supporting cast. However, Colin Jevons will be a familiar name to anyone familiar with the Granada Sherlock Holmes series. But the cast is solid and, perhaps more importantly, believable in their roles. So with all of that, can you guess which adaptation I picked as the best overall?
Because I have a strange feeling with regard to you. Especially when you're near to me as now. And if that boisterous channel and 200 miles of land come broad between us, I'm afraid some cord of communion will be snapped. Then I shall take to bleeding inwardly.
Yeah, this should come as no surprise to anyone who's been paying attention thus far. Out of all the versions that I watched for this video, this one was my favorite, as well as being the most faithful and entertaining of all of them. The 1983 version has a lot going for it. Good acting, a solid script and direction, and some very nice sets and costumes. The BBC has a reputation of doing good adaptations, and this version just adds to that. This one clocks in at about 5.5 hours, which means that there's enough room for things that shorter adaptations miss, which will please fans of the original book. I really can't recommend the 1983 version enough. It's just that good. Plus, it's relatively easy to find, which is a bonus. Even though it's over 30 years old at this point, don't let that turn you away from this one. It's one of the best adaptations I've seen of one of my favorite books. So go, find it, watch it, and enjoy.